As Sergio said, I'll be talking about the double burden of malnutrition for the next 1 hour and 45 minutes. And basically, there will be two different sections. In the first section, I'll be talking about this, a lot of concepts, theories, and what, and like this kind of things. And the other one will be the practical session, which I think you'll find interesting because we will want you to work through 4 different cases in lower and middle income countries and how you will be addressing those cases. So please, if you have any questions, just interrupt me. You can write in the chat message, and because that is also, very much depend, the case study will depend on the content, the theoretical part. So I want you to ask me as many questions as you want. So by the end of this session, I would want you to gain the knowledge on the key concept of malnutrition and different forms of malnutrition, and about the double burden of malnutrition. What is the double burden and who is affected, where and why is the causes? And also one of the main content, the objective is to give you knowledge on the measures to address this double burden, basically focused on the lower and middle income countries. So the key concept, because we are talking about the malnutrition, so I wanted to you to provide an overview of the nutrients. I'm sure you have heard a lot about the nutrients. Can any one of you tell me what you understand by nutrient in a general term? Yeah.
You can just unmute, guys, and give a.
For me, that's basically everything that's connected to food. Mm-hmm. So everything that that the building parts of food.
Yeah. Exactly. Any other answers or anything you want to add besides what we just heard? Okay. Basically, that's what nutrients is all about. So nutrients are the nourishing substance that we obtain from food. So we eat a lot of foods. From each of all the foods, we get at least some of the nutrients. So basically, there are 2 different kinds of nutrients depending on the quantity that is required for our body. For example, the macronutrients are the nutrients that are required in a larger amount. For example, the protein, carbohydrate, and fats. And the micronutrients are the nutrients that are required in a smaller quantity, but are essential for the body function. And the water is another essential nutrient. So nutrients is, it's all a combination of all these 7 different types of nutrients and how they interact in our body. So basically about the malnutrition, I'm sure you know a lot about malnutrition. Also, just maybe one of you can take a lead just to share what you understand by malnutrition. Yeah, I can't hear you.
I think that malnutrition is like overnutrition or undernutrition.
Mm-hmm.
Undernutrition, and also includes, for example, like vitamins or micro nutrient deficiency.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Any other responses? So you know already about malnutrition, right? Okay, so exactly, the malnutrition is any deficiency or excesses or imbalance in a person's intake of the energy or nutrients that we just discussed in our previous slide. So if there is any imbalance, deficiencies or excess, that leads to malnutrition. And you rightly said there are 2 different forms of malnutrition. The one is the undernutrition. Undernutrition is insufficient intake of energy and nutrients to meet the individual's need of maintaining the good health. And there are 2 different forms of undernutrition. The one is the growth failure. So growth failure is basically, it's a kind of physical, visible growth failure that is mostly measured in terms of 3 different categories: stunting, wasting, and underweight. So stunting is generally low height for age, For example, there is the standard height for certain age that, for example, the WHO recommends. So if a person is lower than that standard height for his age or her age, then we call it stunting. And the wasting is low weight for height. So if the person is, has a low height, low weight for the height of the standard, height, then it's a wasting, and the underweight is measured in terms of low weight for age. And the micronutrient deficiencies is the other form of the undernutrition that is normally hidden because it's very difficult to identify looking at the person whether that person might be deficient in terms of micronutrient or not. And it's the deficiency in terms of vitamin and minerals. Like it could be there are a lot of vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, and minerals such as zinc, iron, those other micronutrients. And the obesity is the other form, like the overweight, obesity, or the non-communicable diseases is the other category of malnutrition. Obesity is normally when a person, when a person is too heavy for his or her height, and it's the fat accumulation in the body, it's the obesity, and or the overweight. And the diet-related NCDs are because there are so many non-communicable disease whose main risk factor is the diet, such as the heart disease, which is linked to the high blood pressure, diabetes, and cancer. So how do we measure these different forms of malnutrition? Like, I don't want to discuss in detail about it, but just to give you an overview of how we identify this, also in different program settings. A lot of countries, the lower and middle income countries, they target children under 5 years of age, and the adults, especially the pregnant and lactating women, in their nutrition programs, and they use these different approaches to, to identify the nutritional status. If we look at the children under 5 years of age, we already discussed about underweight, stunting, and wasting. And also we measure the wasting using the mid-upper arm circumference. The others, in case of overweight and obesity, there are also the standard that we measure, like using the, normally we rely to the WHO growth standards. So for example, if we look at the underweight, for the children less than 5 years of age, if a person is less than the, the median, the standard deviation, the median weight for his or her age, less than by, the below -3 standard deviation, it's underweight. So similar is the in the measuring kind of criteria for the stunting and wasting, like based on the standard deviation, but the stunting is, as I said, the height for age, and wasting is measured in terms of weight for certain height. And in terms of, let's also talk about the adults. In adults, we normally measure the body mass index. Maybe most of you already know about the BMI. There are so many applications nowadays that we can just use, these apps to calculate the BMI, the body mass index. And the body mass index is normally a person's weight in kilogram divided by the square of his or her height in meters. So this is the form of the growth failure that we measure, but the micronutrient deficiencies are measured in a different way. Normally, these are very kind of biochemical measures, measuring, taking one's blood or urine samples to measure these different deficiencies in the micronutrient. Yeah, just please interrupt me if you have any questions. Yeah, okay. So let's do one exercise. There is one case. So if an adult's weight is 90 kg and height is 5 feet and 8 inches, so what would be the BMI? So I cannot somehow look at the chat screen.
Okay. Molly answered around 27.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's around 27 or 28. Yeah. So that person is overweight. If we look at this table, so a BMI that is greater than or equals to 25 is overweight. So that person is overweight. Okay. Okay, so next slide. How many of you have seen this chart before? So have you seen, any one of you, maybe you have seen this similar chart in Netherlands or any other countries? So, sorry, can you please talk because I somehow cannot see this the chat screen.
Yeah, I think I've seen it before in
Yes.
primary school, when they measured your height and looked at your weight.
Yeah, so can you please share a bit more about this? Like maybe you already know about it.
Well, they kind of check if your height and your weight is kind of according to the average of, for example, the Netherlands. If you're on the curve, then you're around average, and if you're very much from the curve, then it's too high or too low or whatever.
Yeah, you are right. So this is the World Health Organization that actually they formulate this curve to make the standard, and almost all the countries they follow these growth charts, and this is also in the regular program in the developing countries as well as developed countries. So looking at this chart, we will know, whether the child is below the average or above the average. And there are different charts for the height for age or stunting, for example, and wasting and underweight. And there are different charts, the requirement, the criteria for the boys and girls. So if you look at this chart, like the green line, it shows the average. And if someone is below this -2, the red line is the under nutrition, like maybe stunting or wasting or underweight. And if it's above +2, then it's overweight. It's above +2, and if it's like weight or height, then it's overweight, the BMI. Okay. So here is an example, like this is another graph. If you look at this graph, you will see there is one dot plotted in the graph, right? There is somewhere, and the person is almost 1 year old. Yeah, can you see this? So so then if we look at this graph, then we can see that for the person like who is 1 year old, the length or height is around like 66, 67 centimeter. So which is below -2 J score. Then this person is stunted because it's below -2. I just received one. Yeah, there is one question from Bo. Does the WHO use different charts for different regions and different countries? Normally, there is they are contextualized for different countries, but especially I have seen it for the birth weight. Like for example, for the birth weight, the minimum criteria for the developing countries is 2.5 kg. So if a child is below 2.5 kg, it's the low birth weight. But that is different in developed countries. Like in developed countries, it is mostly 3 kg. So it depends. But for this, the stunting or wasting, it is standardized. And I don't know of any, if there are any differences, but normally it's standardized across all the countries. So for the birth weight, it's different in developing countries. Well, okay. So the double burden. So we are entering the topic, the double burden, and I would like to share one video. Oh.
Double burden of malnutrition is a situation where overweight and obesity exist side by side with undernutrition in the same country. And we are seeing this in a lot of the countries that are developing economically. These are the countries that are going through the nutrition transition. And you then see obesity, overweight existing side by side with undernutrition.
While undernutrition still kills almost 1.5 million women and children every year, growing rates of overweight and obesity worldwide are driving a rise in diseases like cancer, heart disease, stroke, and diabetes.
Okay. So the double burden of malnutrition is the situation where underweight, like undernutrition, exists along with the overweight or obesity or other diet-related non-communicable diseases that we just was in the video. And this kind of the double burden is, exists in different levels, like within individuals, household, or the populations. So within individual, the same person can be deficient in micronutrients, for example, iron deficiency. Anemia is one of the main problems in developing countries among children and women of reproductive age. So the same person can also be overweight. So in that case, it's the double burden existing within the individual. So if we talk about the household level, at the household level, there can be two different persons having two different forms of malnutrition. For example, a pregnant woman can have the micronutrient deficiencies, the deficiency in iron, the iron deficiency anemia, and a child can be overweight. So that's at the household level. And the population's level, it depends. The population level could be at the community level or at the national level or regional level, province, So it can be the case in the total community or the country. There has the multiple forms of this malnutrition, like both the undernutrition and also obesity, overweight, or the non-communicable disease. So the double burden exists in different levels. And but it actually it's it exists throughout the life course. So if someone is risk to overweight in the early ages, like if the person is overweight, then it's very the chances are very high that the person will be overweight throughout the life, and it exists throughout the life cycle. And so next is where, because now we are focusing on the lower and middle income countries, but we would also like to discuss what is the transition in the problem. So here is the graph, the two different graphs, the one from 1990s, the another is from 2010. So it's this graph shows the differences in the problem, if we compare the 1990s and the 2010. So when you look at this graph, what is your first impression? Can you tell, write in the chat, what do you observe when you look at the differences?
Some countries don't have, more countries have no double burden of malnutrition, and more countries do, I think.
Yes. And what are those countries that have the double burden? Like any, maybe you can guess. And is there the shift? Is there a change in the burden from 1990s to 2010? Do you find any differences?
Well, in the Americas, there was the double burden with a lot of overweight. But in 2019, or what year? 2010s, there's no double burden of malnutrition.
Yeah.
But in Africa, for example, the burden of overweight has increased.
Yes. So basically, low and middle income countries are now mostly affected by the double burden. As you can see, in 1990s, the problem was most prevalent in the Southern America, some of the countries in South America and in Mexico and some parts of Africa and Asia. But if we look at the data from 2010, there is the change, and a lot of countries in Asia and Africa are now experiencing the double burden, especially South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific region. So what I mean to say is now, like there is the shift, this transition in the double burden. Those countries in lower and middle income were not having this double burden before are now, there is the prevalence is very high in these countries. And this is the similar graph, but this is only this is the recent graph. Here you can even see the existence of 3 different forms of malnutrition, like 2 different forms, but still within the undernutrition also you can see the anemia and stunting. The 2 different forms of undernutrition are also existing. For example, in Africa, if you look at the countries in Africa, and again in the Asia, the Pacific region and East Asia region, so there are these different forms of double burden. So here you can see most of the countries in Africa and Asia are suffering from this double burden. Okay. So do you have any questions so far? Okay, so next we go to the causes of the double burden, and for that I'm presenting one video, and this is from one of the countries that is experiencing a lot of problem in the double burden, Indonesia, and I hope you'll find some insights on the risk factors, the causes.
yang kembar, yang 1 kali kan beratnya 21, yang kedua 16,5.
They were underweight starting at 4 months because they didn't get, the mothers didn't exclusively breastfeed the child. Because at 4 months, the fathers got sick and had been hospitalized for 1 month. The neighbors kind of feel pity to the family, so they start giving like infant formula to the twins.
Kadang adik bintang dikasih, kadang roti, kadang biskuit, kadang agar itu wafer ya mau.
mother, but for the father too. The counseling about first-handed about the food, about breastfeeding, about initiation, early initiation. It's all about where the baby in hari pertama in.
Okay. So what are your key observations? Can you please share, like, what did you get from the video in terms of malnutrition or the risk factor or causes?
I think that for overnutrition, the biggest causes were that, like, high fat food and highly processed food are very accessible to those people.
Yeah. Any other regions? Anyone else?
Bo added something in the chat.
Yeah. So it's it's a lack of education and information. Yes. Any other regions? Did you also see the growth chart that they were using, the growth monitoring chart? Okay. So the main causes is as you said, the availability of the different foods that are very high in the salt, sugar, and the fats. So I'll come to that slide in the next slide. But before that, I would like to present an overview of the causes of malnutrition. Basically, this is the conceptual framework that is very widely used, and it was proposed by UNICEF in 1990s and has been widely used to define this malnutrition, the both undernutrition and other forms of malnutrition. So basically, when we look at the malnutrition, you can see in this slide that the malnutrition is caused by inadequate dietary intake and also the disease. The dietary intake is linked to some of the content from the video that we saw, like the intake of high calorie foods, as well as a lack of intake of, like the other, for example, the breastfeeding. That is also one of the reasons. And the disease, because in lower and middle income countries, the children are suffering from a lot of diarrheal diseases. So, and the studies have shown that these diarrheal diseases are linked to undernutrition. So these are the immediate causes that are caused by the other underlying causes, like such as access to food. In many households, they don't have food to eat. And the discussion about the dietary diversity comes in the second part. But before that, they don't have any food to eat. In terms of undernutrition. So that's the inadequate access to food, but also the access to the food that is very high in sugar and salt and fat content, if we talk about the overnutrition. So this is one of the underlying causes. The other causes are the inadequate care. So also we just watched in the video that there were the twins and their father was sick, and they didn't have access, they didn't have proper care. So that also contributed to lack of food, the lack of breast milk consumption. And also the other reason is insufficient health services. For example, the pregnancy care services also contribute a lot to the disease, but also the care and the adequate consumption of the nutrition supplements, like the iron and the folic acid. So These are the underlying causes, and there are other basic causes like the poverty, the resources, access to land, or where they can grow some foods, like those kind of different resources. So this is basically the tree diagram, the problem tree diagram that tells you how different basic causes leads to the underlying cause and the immediate cause, and ultimately it leads to the malnutrition. Yeah. So this slide is the reflection of what we just saw in the video also. There is a very rapid changes in the diets because of the availability and intake of the cheap ultra processed food. So even in the lower income countries, it's not only about the countries that don't have that good economic status, but also in the countries with the lower economic status, this kind of ultra processed foods are very cheaply available in the market. And so the other thing is, as I said before, when the children or a child consumes these foods during the first 1,000 days in the early life, then the effects actually they can last for a longer period of time. Do you know what could be this 100 days? Have you heard about 1,000 days before? Anyone? Thousand days? Okay. So 1,000 days is basically the period, from pregnancy until the child reaches 2 years of age. So if we count the days from pregnancy to the 2 years of life, then it is 1,000. Like for example, the pregnancy is 9 months, and if you multiply it by 30, it's like 270 days. And the other remaining days until 2 years make the 1,000 days. So a lot of organizations and like these partners, they take this 1,000 days as a window of opportunity. It's not only in terms of nutrition, but also to improve the health status, the educational and other, like the early child development. So it's the window of opportunity that if you intervene in this early age, the 1,000 days, then there will be a good, the improvement in the health and nutrition in the later years of life. So that is the reason why we also promote 1,000 days in many other programs. The other factor, the other thing is, and there is a reduction in the physical activity. This also applies to the high income countries because the consumption of these kind of foods and the reduction in the physical activity has also contributed to the overweight or obesity. And it takes a lot of effort to offset the effects of ultra processed foods. For example, if you drink like 355 ml bottle of sugar sweetened beverage, then it requires a 1.5 mile walk, or you need to run for at least 15 minutes, for the, to address, to halt the effect of this food in terms of weight gain or fat gain. So those all the causes are. Now we can look at the 4 different levels. If we look from the social and demographic, so the socioeconomic condition, for example, the poverty is very much linked to the undernutrition, and also the like the obesity and overweight. But there are also some studies that say like, there is also also linked to the double burden of malnutrition. But so it's very complex on how you address this poverty, the socioeconomic situation, because, for example, when we collected the data in Bangladesh, the households were, like they said, like they were very poor, they couldn't afford the food, the nutrient-rich food. Then when the women, for example, they knew a lot of, about the nutrition, they had the knowledge of nutrition, but because their children were insisting so much that they had to buy this, the children's, whenever they used to go with their mothers, they had to buy this, the packaged foods from the shops, from the market. So that, like the economic status may not always, work in some people. Then there are so many other factors that affect the malnutrition. The food insecurity is lack of food access. Not only the, like you need to have access to the also the micronutrient-rich food. And the other factor is the biological factor, a lot of, because we already talked about the early life experiences. So if you have, the experience in the early life, that will lead to the chances, the chances are high that you will be malnourished in the later lives. And also from the transmission from the woman to her child, like if a pregnant woman is stunted or is, so that can be, it's also the chance that the child will be undernourished, or the overweight will also cause to the undernutrition in the child. And the other is the environmental factors, the food supply and system. So nowadays, the market in the developing countries, they are, that they have a lot of these foods, as we already discussed about it. So, and the choice for the healthy food options is very limited. And also the food portions, sizes, and the cost, like there's very cheap, these ultra processed foods are very cheap. So that also contributes to the double burden. And the trade policy, like the policy of selling different kind of foods and, the food items. This is all about the food system. And the next is the behavioral, the lifestyle and the habits, the sedentary lifestyles, for example, and psychological factors. So this is a kind of, the circle that, kind of complex drivers that work around across different, factors, and that contribute to the double burden. Okay. So why do we need to act? So we talked a lot about the causes and what the problem is. So let's talk about why we need to act about double burden. So first is, have you heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Anyone?
Yes, Indu, we discussed it a few times in our lectures.
Yes, so like there is the double addressing the double burden is linked to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of hunger, health, education, and all other Sustainable Development Goals. So it's critical to both health and also the economic development. And the focus on the integrated solutions will tackle the malnutrition. I'll come to the integrated solution in the next slide. It promotes the maternal and infant and child health, because a lot of, almost half of the deaths among the children under 5 years of age is, accounted by the undernutrition. So it's definitely, if we address undernutrition or malnutrition, it contributes to the health. And also, as we already discussed, a lot of risk factors of the non-communicable diseases are the nutrition related. And it improves school and education performance. For example, the stunting, there are the study that say, that the stunting, if the child is stunted, the educational performance is lower because the cognitive development is decreased. And that eventually contributes to, the lower productivity and the economic development. And also having, like the good nutrition will build your immune system so that you can fight against the diseases. So that's why we need this. We need to act on the malnutrition for these several regions, and these are the essential regions. Okay. And so we already talked about the integrated, like, different type of solutions. Like we need this double duty action. It's very complex because in the past, under the lower and middle income countries, we're focusing on the undernutrition. But now we have this challenge that we need to act on undernutrition, but also to address the overnutrition and obesity, so that we call as the double duty actions. And these are achieved through like different sectors and integrated measures, like the health service, social safety nets, educational setting, for example, and the agriculture that will come up in the next slide. And the effects are interconnected, like the good nutrition in the early life, and the diet quality, the diversity in diet, food environments, access to food in the community, and the socioeconomic factors, that these all are interconnected. And if we address to this factor, like, if we have respond from these different sectors, then we can lower the form of malnutrition throughout the life cycle. But how? Okay. So I'm sure you know a lot about the socio-ecological model. Like normally there are, like, 4 different labels, but because this malnutrition and especially the double burden is very complex, so there are, you have to address, like, from these 3, like the 5 different labels, like individual, the interpersonal or the household, organizational, community, and the policy level. And one single solution is not sufficient, because you need this integrated approach, like we also focused on the previous slide about different sectors and role from different, like the integration of the activities. So if you look at, for example, at the individual level, we need to promote the infant and young child feeding. For example, breastfeeding, early initiation of breastfeeding, and the exclusive breastfeeding up to 6 months of age. And I already talked about the 1,000 days, and we need to promote the dietary diversity. I mean, like the access to different food groups, not only few food groups. For example, for the children, the FAO, Food for Agriculture Organization, promotes the consumption of 7 or in like some there is 7 or like the 7 to 9 different groups. For example, the like including the nuts, legumes, vitamin A rich vegetables and fruits, other vegetables and fruits, milk products. So there are a lot of dietary diversity, and there are the other factors, like at the household level also. Because in many settings, for example, the schools, we see that in developing countries, a lot of school premises, they have this market, like the shops, where the people can easily access the processed food. So it is necessary to involve the parents and children in planning the meals, the school meals. And the other, at the household level, you can see the home garden, because the home garden is the entry point to produce a diverse diet in developing countries. And that can, if once you produce, and you can easily access this diverse diet, the food diversity in the production, and also the food security. So you need to have security not only in terms of 1 or 2 specific food groups, but also all the diverse diet, the household dietary diversity, the family planning, because there are this study that show that the parity in like having the number of children is linked to malnutrition. So the family planning would be another approach to intervene from the household or interpersonal level. And the access to money and land. So access to money to buy these nutrient-rich foods, and the land to produce. At the organizational level, for example, there has to be, the food should be available at the organization. So if we look at the school level, at schools should provide you healthy meals. And if we look at our working environment, for example, we should be able to buy the healthy food in the working environment. And the school garden, for example, there are so many countries that already piloted and are implementing the school garden activities, where children and the parents also participate in the production of, like the vegetables at the school, and they use those products for the meal, the school meal. And a sedentary time, like for example, most of the time we do this, we have this work, like, that our work is based on the kind of sedentary habit, like working on the computers, and, and if we do not do the physical exercise, then that also can contribute to the overnutrition. At the community level, the access to services, like the pregnancy care services, in the pregnancy care services, they don't only provide you the capsules, the iron tablets, but also they counsel in the developing countries. They provide you the counseling on the nutrition and what to do, like what foods to eat, and after delivery care. And the other was the growth monitoring. All the countries, they have, these different countries, they have this growth monitoring programs, and they have this in which they record the weight of child. For example, here in Netherlands, I know that, maybe like I think it's called KKD. So in KKD, so if they actually record the growth of child, in the height and then weight. So they have, they have this different, but in many developing countries, for example, in Nepal, the routine health service is, they only record weight and they don't record the height. Yeah, I think, yes, the consultancy bureau, yes, consultant, yes, yeah. So, yeah, so they do monitor the growth, and that is the program at the community level. And the other is at the community level, you also need to see, like, what is the market like in the community? Are there any options for healthy food availability, or the market only has this, the processed food? So those are the, the factors, or at the community level. And the policy level, food policy, for example, when we collected the data in Bangladesh, a lot of participants, they talked about food price fluctuation. They have this policy where they standardize the food price, and sometimes they cannot afford, certain healthy products due to that change, in the food price. So, for example, that is the food policy. And also, it also talks about whether the food policy, like what kind of foods is being promoted, is the micronutrient-rich food and other foods. Other is the Breast Milk Substitute Act. I don't know in Netherlands, but in some countries like Nepal, there is the act that these private companies cannot promote this breast milk substitutes unless there is some emergency, like unless in the situation that there is no milk produce, or this kind of emergencies or other extra situations, like they cannot promote the breast milk. In Nepal, for example, and also the guidelines. For example, in the school, like a lot of this past program focused on undernutrition. So all the guidelines, most of the guidelines were focused on undernutrition, and it didn't specifically look at overnutrition or obesity. So, but now it's the time that there has to be revised. For example, the subsidies, food transfer, like World Food Program and other programs. For example, in the emergencies, they transfer the rice, like rice, lentils, oil, and this kind of foods. And we need to, because if we want to address this double burden, then there should be also the mechanisms of transferring the micronutrient-rich foods. The taxation, I'm not sure about the taxation, but it would be good to provide, the charge extra tax to those companies that, sell this energy dense food, and also incentives to those that biofortified. So biofortified means when they produce, for example, rice, in the rice, some of the rice, when they are produced, then they are already, they use this fortified variety where, they also have this extra nutrients and minerals. And also the sweet potato, in many kind of the sweet potato also we can see, like in some of the developing countries, they fortified sweet potato with vitamin A. It's a biofortification. It's not about the fortification during processing, but the fortification before harvesting, like when producing. So those kind of activities also, should we provide the incentives. I'm sure you have some questions. So also what I want to say is, as I said before, we need an integrated approach, because addressing from one level, like individual or organizational only, for example, doesn't work. Like in some cases can work, but we need to, work from these multiple entry points. Yeah, any questions?
I was wondering. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if the approaches now are like very different for a certain population, if they're really focused on a certain population and looked at what the problems there are and how to deal with it, or if there's more of a global approach.
Yes, this is a kind of very generic approach, right? Like and like before, as I said, like a lot of program, they focus on the target, like different target, and whether that there is which form of malnutrition, whether if there is a problem of undernutrition, they focus more on improving the nutritional status, like the reducing the undernutrition. But if it's more on the obesity or overweight, then that has to be the targeted accordingly. But this is the general framework. Actually, this is adapted from two different papers, that from the one from the recent review and the Lancet paper. So this is the general framework, and this, but it may not, like you need to contextualize based on different cases. But most of the time we promote, like this, for example, this is the general kind of, we say this, we require this kind of activities, or these kind of measures will address the malnutrition. So you can apply all of these measures, or can, plan some of them, but that it's good to provide from multiple, like multiple levels, some multiple level interventions. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your doubt or not.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there was someone like asking.
Yeah, I had another question about also the SEM approach, but also about that we just talked about the discussion between high income countries and low middle income countries.
Yes.
And about obesity and malnutrition. And I was just wondering if there are any correlations or studies or something between rural and urban kind of divides, right? Because in, say, Nepal, for example, in the rural areas, as far as I'm concerned, the main food intake is, for example, through dal bhat, right? But then in Kathmandu, which is the city, there's more access to this highly processed food. So what about in those low middle income countries where in the rural communities, there's not even any access to high processed food? Is that like are there studies on that, or?
Yes, I think, yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. There is one study which is also in the reference list. They did this review, the review based on the socio-ecological model for the double burden. And at the community level, they have this variation in the rural versus urban. So if you go back to the study, you can read in detail. So there are some evidence on the differences in between rural and urban settings. That you are correct. So that is one of the, like the differences at the community level. So that study is in the, I have listed it in the reference section. That is one. Another point was about access to these ultra-processed foods in the rural level. I think that was also my impression when I was, before I went to the field. But when I was, when I went to Laos, for example, even in the communities where there is no road transport, they have the packaged foods. And I was surprised to see that, like, they don't have other healthy options. Like, they don't, like in Laos, in most of the communities, they don't drink milk. That's the cultural or tradition. But in these kind of unhealthy foods were available there. And the main reasons, one of the main reasons is because they are very cheap, as I said, and also the food waste, maybe, like that could be one of the reasons why you also knew from the interview that the wastage of this kind of food is very low. So like the market is totally different, like in the low, like that part, and maybe in some parts there are no access, but we cannot say that in rural areas we cannot get this ultra processed food, which is actually the reason, because this is the region, like, because the rural areas have now more access to this kind of foods. That's the reason why the double burden is increasing in the lower and middle income countries.
Can I add to that, Indu?
Yes.
Because I know the African context, and I also wanted to reply that we must not underestimate the impact of globalization. So in African settings where I've worked in South Africa and Zimbabwe, it's exactly the same as what Indu just said about Laos. In the rural areas, there is no less access to processed foods than in the urban areas. Yes, maybe in the urban areas there is a McDonald's or there is a Burger King, which is not present in the rural areas. But I have visited rural areas where Fanta and Coca-Cola are the main beverages that children of 3 or 4 years of age are drinking throughout the day. And there are snacks and chips and potato chips and biscuits and sweets. They are plenty available in rural areas as well.
Yeah.
In the African context.
So I think this is the global problem because also in some cases, I also heard that the farmers, they produce milk and they actually sell milk, right, in the market. And when they sell milk, with that money, you know, that money, they actually buy some these kind of snacks, you know, for their kids. That we also heard this kind of stories. So the knowledge, so that's, you know, these problems are very complex. You know, we need to intervene the market, the knowledge awareness, you know, the access to food. So this is actually very complex, and that's why we need this multiple approach and integrated approach. Yeah, I think your question is answered.
Yeah, thank you for the extensive answer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and any other questions, or if you want to know more about this, you can always, you know, like, but now if there are any other questions, just you can write also in the chat. Okay, next one. Yes, these are the sectors, as I said before. So the model, you know, we need to intervene from the agriculture, the educational setting, the food system, social safety nets, as I said about the transfer programs, this cash transfer, the food transfer, then, you know, in that also we need to think about it, the food environment, the health services. So we need to, you know, work from these all different dimensions to address the problem.